Welcome. This DDi CADcast covers SolidWorks virtual components. Today's topics include what are SolidWorks virtual components, creating virtual components, working with virtual components in SolidWorks, saving virtual components externally, and the pros and cons with SolidWorks virtual components. So what are virtual components? Why are they important? Virtual components are basically SolidWorks models that are inside of assembly files that are saved internally to the assembly. This means that we do not have an actual directory inside of Windows Explorer for these to save into. In addition to having just virtual components, we can also have virtual assemblies created inside of the assembly. And like I mentioned earlier, we have no directories present inside of Windows Explorer whatsoever with these components. So there are four main ways that we can create virtual components within SolidWorks. Let's go take a closer look. So here we have SolidWorks with a general assembly, some sub-assemblies, and some top-level components. The first way to create a virtual component within SolidWorks is to simply go in and insert a new part from the Insert menu, Component, select New Part. This will allow us to pick a template, and now we can begin to model in our virtual component. Ever since SolidWorks 2008, creating new SolidWorks components automatically induces virtual components. Let's assume that we're going to be building a larger op-amp for this little electronic box. Or perhaps some sort of enclosure. Once I finish editing the component within the assembly and I go back to editing assembly, you'll notice in the design feature tree that we have a new instance with part 1 as the name. We know that this is a virtual component by the fact that we have brackets surrounding the name of the component in the design tree. So by default, when creating new components in the context of the assembly, all these new components will manifest as virtual components. A second way to make components virtual are by taking existing external components and doing a right-click over them to make them virtual. For example, I can take this ribbon cable component, do a right-click, and from the right-click menu I can select Make Virtual. You'll be given a feedback asking you to confirm the fact that we're making this virtual and breaking any external references to the original file. Go ahead and say OK. The component now will become virtual. We indicate that it's virtual because of the brackets that show up within the name of the feature tree. Now, behavior to take note of this is external files within the top level of the assembly are candidates for becoming virtual components. If you have components that are within the subassembly, you will have to open those separately and then make those virtual in turn. A third way to make a virtual component is by using a little Windows magic. For example, if I take the existing first virtual component we created, I can select it, I can do a copy, and I can do a paste. Also, Control-C and Control-V also works. And now I have two instances of this little electronics sub-enclosure for the electronics box. A fourth way to create a virtual component within SolidWorks is by going into the Insert menu under Component, and instead of creating a new part, we can choose an existing part and make it virtual. Let's go ahead and try this out. We're going to choose Existing Part. I'm going to go and browse to a sandbox of components I have for this assembly. I'm going to choose Open to point to this model. And now within my Options menu, I'm going to check box Make Virtual. Upon inserting this component within my assembly, I'm going to get a feedback. Once I confirm the feedback to make this virtual, my very last instance is going to say copy of whatever the part number was, and again, the indicator that this particular part is virtual are the brackets within the design tree. These are the 4 ways to create virtual components within SolidWorks. Now that we know how to create virtual components, let's determine how to work with virtual components within the assembly environment. Because virtual components exist within the domain of the assembly, renaming also occurs within the assembly file. To rename a component, simply right-click over the component in the design tree and choose Rename Part. At this point, we have an opportunity to put in a part number or a descriptive name to our component. Selecting Enter or clicking away will confirm the rename. Next, let's explore the ability to move your components within the design tree. In SolidWorks, I can take the virtual component, and if I click and drag, I can choose a new target location anywhere within my design tree for this new virtual component. Notice I've taken it from the very, very bottom of the tree, moved it to second in line within the design tree. I can also take the component and add it to a subassembly. Now, because virtual components exist in the main assembly that we created them in, if I were to switch and move this into a subassembly, we're basically going to go in and break these references from the original assembly, hence the pop-up we get here screen. So once we confirm this, we can see that that particular component is going to exist within the new subassembly. Also, because we created this component as an in-context component, we have some mates here that we're going to be basically detaching. In this case, the in-place mates that occur upon creating a new virtual component or a new component for an assembly. Once we get the pop-up for the assembly structure editing, I'm going to confirm the move. And now if we look inside of our design tree, the original component now exists within the subassembly. Now you may notice that we have a new name there for the actual virtual component. We'll get to that in a couple minutes. Another topic with regards to virtual components that we all should know about is the ability to create independent copies of virtual components. For example, let's go in and take our copy of this power supply and let's make a new copy of it. Once I go in and generate a new copy, I can take either instance and I can make one independent of the other copy. Once I make the copied component independent of the original, any changes made to one or the other will not affect one or the other. For example, if I go in and I edit this particular component and make a quick change, you'll notice that this is truly an independent component. Once we've made one of these components independent, we can't reconnect the references back together. It's very similar to going in and breaking references within context designs. A workaround would be to delete the independent component, bring up another copy, mate it, or perhaps do a replace. Next, let's talk about some default behaviors with regard to virtual components. Let's start with an option that we have inside of Systems Options. Now, we've mentioned that whenever we go in and we generate a new component, the default behavior with SolidWorks is to generate a virtual component. If this is something you don't want to happen by default, you can go into the Systems Options menu, under Assemblies, and turn on the option for Save New Components to External Files. With this new option on, when I go in and I generate a new component, SolidWorks will still ask me for the template. When I click OK, however, it will ask me for a physical location or an actual directory for where I want to save this new component, external from the assembly file. Another default behavior that we should know about involves working with Pack and Go. If I wanted to go in and create a Pack and Go of this assembly, the behavior that we exhibit is that we cannot go in and add a prefix nor a suffix to any of our virtual components. Once I make the change for the prefix, you'll notice that my virtual components remain unchanged. Another option I want you to be aware of with regards to virtual components is under Systems Options and External References. If you turn on the Open Reference Documents with Read-Only Access, most people assume that this also includes virtual components. Now this is not the case because virtual components are embedded inside assemblies or subassemblies and are therefore not considered external references. As a result, this particular option doesn't apply to them. The only way to get around this is to save these as external reference parts, and then the option will be applied to them. So the main concept to understand with these virtual components is that Windows read and write access will be the same as it is for the general assembly. Next, let's talk about an extension of moving our virtual components from one assembly to a subassembly perhaps. Let's set up a scenario here. So let's say I bring in a component here, just an existing component. Now I'm going to go in and make this component virtual, and I'm going to align it there to my origin just as a good practice. So now I have a virtual component within the assembly. I'm going to go in and make a copy of the virtual component, and perhaps make a copy of the virtual component. Now with my two additional copies of this linkage component, I'm going to make a subassembly and just pick a template. Now let's take a look at what this is saying here on the pop-up. If I'm moving one virtual component from one assembly to the other, it has to rename the components. So let's go ahead and click OK on that. And now when we go in and expand the subassembly, you can see there that we have indeed renamed the actual copies. So now it says copy of whatever this component is. The reason for this is that the new copy has no link to the original. Just by definition of virtual components, these are components that live and are embedded within the parent assembly file. Since we've made that change, we can't actually do a move in the traditional sense. It's going to be a copy. Okay, let's go back and let's talk about the fact that when we inserted a component, we made it virtual. For example, if I do another copy here and I bring it over on the top here, maybe I'll put it on the bottom. I made this particular component a virtual component. We've broken the references to the original component. But what if we wanted to relink the references to the original component? The best thing we can do is do a replace. To do a replace component, simply right-click over the component we want to replace it with, go in and choose Replace Components, and browse for the particular component that you want to replace it with. In this case, it's a part file. Once you click OK, now we can go in and check the file references, and we can see that our particular instance is now pointing to the original file. That's as close as we can get to going in and repointing, essentially doing a replace for a virtual component. The next behavior I want you to be aware of, or the next observation, is with regards to in-context editing. If you're creating a new component as a virtual component, for example, if you look at the bottom here, we've created this particular block. We've given it a particular name. Notice that when we rename that, it still maintained the caret at power supply, etc., whatever the general assembly name was. Now, sometimes we get questions with regards to, can you actually remove the bracket or the caret power supply flow or whatever that general parent assembly name is and only keep the actual part number or the name? And ever since 2010 and later, we cannot change that functionality. So by default, it had part 1, caret, then assembly name. If I wanted to simply rename this to just plain part 1, that is not a possibility starting from 2010 and later, due to changes done internally to the SolidWorks software. The last behavior in this portion of the presentation I want you to be aware of is the fact that we cannot make a drawing file out of virtual components. Drawing files, just by design, requires a file reference, and these are only given to external reference parts. So as we know, virtual components only exist within the parent assembly. So what we need to do is save the actual part file externally, and so that it does have an external reference. After we've completed that operation, we can go in and generate a regular drawing file to bring in model views, model items, and annotations, etc. This brings us to our next topic, the topic of saving virtual components externally. So if you do have the need to take these virtual components to the next level and make some detailed drawings from them, you can essentially salvage them from this mode, this limbo or virtualized mode, and give them a true or proper reference directory. There are two ways of doing this. The first one is just if I close any assemblies that have a brand new virtual component that hasn't been saved, it's going to give me a pop-up. It's going to ask me if I would like to save the components internally or externally with a little bullet button. For example, if I go back to perhaps another assembly here, I have a freshly made virtual component that has not been saved. If I decide to close this assembly file, I say save all, it's going to first of all pick a location for my general assembly, then it's going to look at my virtual components and allow me to make a selection as far as saving them internally as a virtual component or saving them externally and specifying a path. If I select save internally, I've allowed that virtual component to retain its dependency on the parent, and it saves the virtual assembly. Let's say that I want to save the virtual component external to the original file or assembly file. Let's say this enclosure part, I want to save these externally. You simply do a right click over the virtual component and you say save part in, and then I can select the component. I can specify the same assembly path as the original parent general assembly, or I can specify a path in which I want to save this component in. Once I click OK, the software will go ahead and remove the little brackets that indicate them being virtualized, and now it's a component that has a true directory, and based off of the previous section, I can go in and make a drawing file just the same as any other component inside of my SolidWorks environment. And so those are the two ways of going in and saving your components with SolidWorks virtual components. So lastly, let's talk about the pros and cons of using virtual components. They're basically balanced out. If I look through all the pros, the number one pro that most people find appealing to virtual components is the fact that you reduce file management with many files. You basically can start off with a base part and go in, and with our process of doing in-context design, it'll automatically go in and generate all of these files internal to the assembly, so that when you go in and you move your components, you don't have to worry about doing a SolidWorks move, worrying about where all your different file references are pointed. Everything is just done because it's internal to your main assembly file. Another pro is that it's good for top-down assembly modeling. If you're going in and you're making changes and you're wanting to reference components, it becomes easier to move them from one to the other. So I guess that would be, you can merge those two bullets together. Also, overall, if you're doing an assembly with sub-assemblies, top-level components, and you have a couple of virtual components, and your overall model size will not increase or decrease. You're just displacing where you're placing your components. You still have to have a disk space for them, whether that be as separate items inside of a folder in Windows Explorer or embedded within the general parent assembly. Another popular thing I see with regards to using virtual components are that you can use them as placeholders for non-model items, things like paint or glue, things that aren't actually physically shown in your model, but does need a place in your parts lists or bill of materials so that you can add some specs on them. Some of the cons with working with virtual components are the fact that virtual components are all consolidated into one file. So the phrase, don't put all your eggs in one basket, applies with virtual components. If you have a situation where that particular assembly file becomes corrupted, something has happened to it, you lose it, now you've lost all of that work for all of those virtual components because they're all embedded within the one file. Now another con is I guess that I can put it into the con section, is this is actually a common question I get. If I go in and I create components as virtual components, will I still see the same performance? Will I see actually a faster performance with regards to rebuilds, because it doesn't have to go in and find all these references? And after some research, I don't see a change in performance with regards to SolidWorks when you're working with regular components versus virtual components. The last con with working with virtual components is the fact that you cannot make drawings out of these virtual components. I did explain that you can go in and save these virtual components as separate items externally, so you can do that and it becomes a fully fledged part file, so you can go in and make the detailed drawings out of them. But in general, working with SolidWorks virtual components is just a preference. I don't see, as far as best practices is concerned, I would probably consider using these as placeholders for non-model items. And in general, if you do a lot of top-down assembly modeling, you may want to consider using virtual components. If you're not a big fan of virtual components, not a big deal. Just go into the options menu under assemblies and uncheck the options for save new components to external files, and then you'll never have to worry about having an automatic virtual component show up. Thank you for viewing this Digital Dimensions CADcast. Please visit us at www.ddicad.com.